Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you all. For those of you who are guests here, welcome to Temple Israel and to the Tri-Faith Commons here in Omaha. We're very proud and excited to welcome you here to Temple Israel. I'm Rabbi Brian Stoller, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to greet you and to welcome you to this community event where we are honored to host Rabbi Joseph Telushkin as our guest speaker this afternoon. I want to say thank you to Donna Gilbert Van and Paul Van and their son David Gilbert, who is sponsoring this wonderful event in honor of our member Howard Kyman's birthday. Howard is David's uncle, and this is a gift from David to our community in honor of Howard. So Howard, happy birthday to you. And I also want to say, in addition to Donna and Paul and David, I'd like to say thank you to our community partners who have all come together to host Rabbi Telushkin today, and that is Bethel Synagogue, a congregation Beth Israel, Chabad of Omaha, and the Jewish Federation of Omaha, together with Temple Israel, are all glad to host today's event. And so I'm going to ask Bob Belgrade to come on up here to the bima. He's going to introduce Rabbi Telushkin for us. Rabbi Telushkin will speak for a little bit and then give us the opportunity for questions and answers. And those of you who are participating here in person and those of you who are online, all will have the opportunity to ask questions. So we'll look forward to that. Bob?
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. I was given this honor by the Kyman family. Howard's a dear friend, and he invited me to introduce Rabbi Telushkin. Howard's got a nice birthday coming up at the end of the month, and he and his family and his a nephew in particular are really honored to welcome Rabbi to Omaha. Joseph Telushkin was named by Talk magazine as one of the 50 best speakers in the United States. He is the author of Jewish Literacy, the most important things to know about the Jewish religion, its people, and its history. This is one of the most widely selling books on Judaism in the past 3 decades. Rabbi Telushkin's book, Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, became the motivating force behind Senators Joseph Lieberman and Connie Mack's Senate Resolution number 151 that established a National Speak No Evil Day throughout the United States and has recently been reissued in a new comprehensively revised edition. He has also authored the 2-volume A Code of Jewish Ethics, a comprehensive presentation of Jewish teachings on the vital topic of personal character and integrity. A Code of Jewish Ethics won the National Jewish Book Award as the Jewish Book of the Year. His 2014 book, Rebbe, The Life and Teachings of Menachem and Schneerson, the most influential rabbi in modern history, became a New York Times bestseller. Rabbi Telushkin's literary output also includes 4 novels, teleplays, and a screenplay. He lectures throughout the United States and Canada and lives with his wife, Devorah, in New York City. We are very honored to welcome Rabbi Telushkin back to Omaha and look forward to hearing your thoughts today.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Mr. Belgrade. I want to thank Rabbi Stoller and Rabbi Barazin here, and I'm very, very pleased to be back in Omaha. I'm very pleased to be here to honor your 92nd birthday, Howard. That's an honor for me. And what I want to speak about really is updated thoughts, some old and some new, that I've had on my book, Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, and what motivated me originally to write it. Unless the only thing I'm going to ask for, could somebody at some point just bring me some water? I don't want to have to send the rabbi out. Okay. Unless you or someone very dear to you has been the victim of terrible physical violence or a terrible crime, there's a good chance that some of the worst pains you've suffered in life have come from words used unfairly, from excessive criticism, from gossip, from somebody having a terrible outburst of anger, a nickname. How many people here ever had a nickname that you hated? What was it? No, I'm joking. I'm joking. And yet we don't always acknowledge it. Kids are taught, sticks and stones can break my bones, but names or words can never hurt me. But the truth is, words can do a great deal of damage. Words actually, historically, have motivated people to pick up sticks and stones and knives and guns to hurt other people. The medieval crusaders who murdered so many Jews didn't get up one morning and out of nowhere suddenly start murdering Jews. They had been conditioned by words to think of Jews as Christ killers or other offensive terms that had the effect of dehumanizing them. It's fascinating how many negative terms were created for black people. Why was it done? Because otherwise people who otherwise thought of themselves as being decent people could never have acted the way they acted towards them. So one of the terrible ways in which words can be used are to dehumanize people and enable people to do things they would never do otherwise. There are two types of forbidden speech in Jewish tradition. One of them is somewhat more known. How many of you have ever heard of the Hebrew expression lashon hara? Okay, I'd say at least half of the hands went up. That's not that common. Most Hebrew words are not that widely known. How many of you are familiar with the term tzedakah? Tzedakah, the Hebrew term for charity, is widely known. And Jewish communities in raising money want people to know the word tzedakah because people who think in terms of tzedakah are apt to give more tzedakah than people who only think in terms of the word charity. Because tzedakah has a connotation that makes it more binding and obligatory. Lashon hara also, which means speaking unfairly of others, also has the same sort of connotation, and it's had the luck to be well known. There's a Hebrew expression, hakol talui b'mazal, afilu sefer Torah ba'aron hakodesh. Thank you so much. You're welcome. Thank you. Perfect. It's nice and cold. Everything depends on luck, even a Torah scroll in the ark, by which they meant, most synagogues. How many Torahs do you have here? Yeah, so you have 4. Most synagogues have 3 or 4 or 5, and they meant some Torah scrolls are lucky and they get read more often, others less so. So Lashon hara became widely known. It's one of 2 terms in Hebrew that deal with the ethics of speech. The other one is just as important, but it's not that well known. How many of you have ever heard of the term ona'at devarim? Okay, other than the rabbis here. Not widely known. It means oppressing with words. What's the difference between Lashon hara and ona'at devarim? Lashon hara refers to how we speak about others and how we can hurt people the way we do. Ona'at devarim is how we speak to others and how we can hurt people with it. And I'd venture to guess as many people are hurt by things that are said to them as about them. I'll give you an area of ona'at devarim. How many of you grew up in a household where somebody's bad temper had a bad effect on the house? Omaha seems to be a much calmer city than New York. Okay. How many of you wish you had better control over your tempers? Okay. Now I'm going to get the honest answer to that question. How many of you are seated next to somebody who you wish had better control over their tempers? Okay. The Bible deals with the issue of anger very, very early on. Very early on in the Bible, the first 2 brothers in history are Cain and Abel, and Cain gets so angry at Abel that he kills him. And what's interesting is, if you look back to the biblical text, I think it's chapter 4, you will find Cain didn't just get up and kill Abel. Cain was angry, and God warned Cain not to do it. And still, he in anger killed his brother. It's not the only example, by the way, in the Bible. There's also the example of Joseph and his brothers, who develop such a dislike for Joseph that they commit an unforgivable, unbelievable sin. They sell him into slavery. But we find that even fights within families are not that uncommon. Now, in response to my first question, where I said almost nobody seemed to grow up in a household where somebody had a bad temper, and how many of your families at the level of first cousin and closer are there people not on speaking terms? Okay, it seems about a third of the hands went up. Now, this is remarkable and sobering. I know as a parent, one of the worst things I could imagine is, for example, my children being on such ill terms that such a thing would happen. In fact, sometimes when I'm dealing with the issue, and as a rabbi doing any counseling, I tell to people, you might think you're respectful towards your parents, but if you don't speak to your sibling, you should know, whether your parents are in this world or out of this world, how painful that would be to them. I mean, except under the most egregious circumstances, that's a very, very sad situation. And yet anger can cause people to do things like that. And anger usually has to do so often with words having been misused. I'll give you another example. The Bible is very cognizant of romantic love. In the Bible, we learn, for example, that Isaac loved Rebekah. I mean, it says that explicitly. Jacob loved Rachel. Samson, less happily, loved Delilah. If you remember that story. By the way, it's an interesting thing. I don't know how much Hebrew people know here, but who knows how to say the word for son in Hebrew? I don't mean child, I mean S-U-N. Do you know the word Shemesh? Okay, Samson's name, Shimshon, came out of the word son. Who's the woman who undoes him? Delilah. What does Lila mean in Hebrew? Night. So there's the clash of sun and night. Okay, but anyway, he loves her, but she doesn't exactly reciprocate his love, and she betrays him. There's only one woman in the Bible whose love for a man is recorded. And it's not one of the most famous women in the Bible. It's a woman named Michal. Michal is the daughter of King David. And on 2 occasions, the biblical text in the first book of Samuel informs us that Michal loved David. David goes to great efforts to win her hand in marriage. So here you think, oh, we're going to come across a really happy marriage. It wasn't. And one of the things that undid their marriage was that when angry, they didn't restrain their tongues. And I'm going to speak about this later. The issue of, if you can't always control your temper, can you control what you do when you're angry? The fight that precipitates the end of their marriage happens on the happiest day, what was supposed to be the happiest day in David's kingship. The Philistines had earlier in a battle conquered the Israelites and had taken possession of the most valuable item in Jewish life, an item so valuable that if archaeologists ever uncovered it, it would eclipse by a factor of 10 any other archaeological discovery. They had taken the ark containing the 10 Commandments. David finally gets the 10 Commandments back, and he leads the people on this, the happiest day in his kingship, in exuberant dancing. Michal, his wife, was herself the daughter of a king, because David was not the first king of Israel. The first king of Israel was Michal's father, Saul. And she looked out the window, it says, and saw David dancing wildly with his subjects as if he was not even their king, but just like one of his subjects. And she thought it beneath the dignity of a king. So when David came back, she says to him, "Oh, you really brought honor upon yourself, dancing with the riffraff like one of the riffraff yourself." David at that point had a number of choices. He could have ignored her and just taken a walk around the palace, or he could have said something, "Yes, Michal," and your not coming out, seems snobbish, and that does it. But she had hurt him. And he wanted to hurt her. So he said, it's true, I danced wildly in front of God, who chose me to be king over Israel instead of your father and your brother. This was only a number of months after Michal's father Saul and 3 of her brothers had been killed in battle against the Philistines. The next verse in the Bible says Michal till her dying day had no children. Now, it's an interesting thing. When you look at Bible commentaries, if they like you, you can get away with anything. The Bible commentaries like David, even though he sometimes did some questionable acts. So they say Michal was punished because she spoke so cruelly to her husband. But the truth of the matter is, what Michal said to David, you danced like one of the riffraff, was obnoxious. What David said to her, bringing in the death of her father and brothers, was cruel. I have a feeling that the reason Michal had no children was because subsequent to that event, they might never have been intimate again. Every year, among the hundreds of thousands of people who get divorced, are people who really did love each other when they got married. And very often, through words, through sarcasm, through cursing, through criticism, through undercutting, people can destroy love. And that destruction of love can be very, very difficult. So what do I want to suggest about that? What can we do? Quite a number of people raised their hands when they said, when I asked, do you wish you had greater control over your temper? I want to give you one guideline. It is not the easiest guideline in the world to follow, but it's not that hard. But if you follow it, you never will say something that will inflict an irrevocable break in a relationship. No matter how angry you get at another person, restrict the expression of your anger to the incident that provoked it. You see, if somebody's done something that hurt you and you focus on that specific act, you're unlikely to say something so ego-damaging that the other person will just withdraw from you. Restrict it to that. It's when David said, made this terrible reference to Michal's father. Or it's when people bring up things that happened 10 years ago. Why is it so terrible when people bring up things that happened many years ago? Because it leaves the other person with the feeling that that other person is always thinking about that event. That, you've never been able to overcome that event. So don't go backwards. If you critique somebody about something that they did now, okay. So you're restricting it to that one thing, and that can be addressed. But when you attack the whole person, it leaves the feeling. And one of the reasons is this is an unfortunate thing. People have a tendency to think that what people say when they're very angry is what they truly feel. Now, what people say when they're very angry is what they truly feel at that moment. But like all human beings, we are a cauldron of emotions. Was I always ecstatic when my wife woke me in the middle of the night to go feed one of our infant children? As I walked over with the bottle, was I always thinking, oh God, thank you, I really enjoy only having 2 hours sleep, just so that I can go up and, and feed them. Very often we can experience emotions of anger and great love towards the same person in the same day. But the unfortunate tendency is to think what somebody says when they're angry, and many people, when they are angry, express a disproportionate anger, but it increases the hurt when the other party feels that. This is what they truly feel. But that's only one aspect of what they feel. So the first thing I request of people is, no matter how angry you get at another person, restrict the expression of your anger to the incident that provoked it. I came across another technique in a Jewish book of moral instruction, written a couple of 100 years ago, but I actually met a man who practiced it, and since he's no longer with us, but since he talked about it, I feel I can say it in his name. It's a man named Sanford Bernstein. Any of you hear of him? He had a very large investment house in New York, and I think it's now called the Lions. And in his later years of his life, he became a religiously observant Jew, He kept the name Sanford Bernstein, but he took the name Zalman. He was working with a Rabbi Shlomo Riskin. Sanford cursed a lot, and Riskin tried to influence him to curse less. And he could curse in a very colorful way. Because he was a very wealthy man, Riskin got him to agree that every time he cursed, he would give $180 to charity. When Riskin first suggested this to him, he said, "Oh, you want me to give it to your yeshiva?" Riskin said no, he didn't want it to be like that. He actually gave it to a Chabad yeshiva, the head of that Chabad yeshiva, to encourage Riskin to study with him several times a day. But he started doing it, so I'm going to encourage you to do it. Give it to a charity, and if it doesn't work, give it to a charity of which you otherwise disapprove. If you're Orthodox, give it to Hebrew Union College Building Fund. If you're Reform, give it to YU. If you're a Republican, we can go on in all sorts of directions in which people can go. But then the other most important thing is to apologize. Now here's an interesting issue, because when you apologize, for the apology to work, you have to take full responsibility on yourself. And I'll give you an example of what I mean when I say that. Many years ago, Devorah and I lived for a couple of years in Boulder, Colorado. At the time, our daughter Shira, who's now 30, was 4, so you can more or less guess how long ago we're talking about, and her older sister Naomi was 6. We were living in Boulder, and I was giving a speech in Denver, which was less than an hour away. And Naomi and Shira said, "Daddy, we want to come to your speech." I knew the speech was going to be over their heads, so I tried to discourage them. I said, "Daddy, we know you go around giving talks. We want to come." So I bring them. There was a large crowd in attendance, and I'm a very proud father. I introduced Shira, I introduced Naomi, everybody applauded, and they took 2 seats in the front row. About 10 minutes into the speech, I asked, "How many of you grew up in a household where somebody's bad temper had a bad effect on the house?" Among the hands that went up were 2 hands in the front row. It was immensely embarrassing. Finally, I came back with the only line I could. "Unfortunately, my wife has a bad temper." Now, what actually had happened was Naomi was in the 1st grade, and they had just started a day school in Boulder. They now have a more advanced one, and they had just started and didn't work out quite as well as we had hoped, which was one of the reasons we ended up moving back to New York. But I was teaching Naomi how to read. And according to my wife, I am very patient the first time I explain something to somebody. According to my wife, I am very patient the second time I explain something. According to my wife, by the 3rd time, I can get snappy. So I apparently had been snapping at Naomi. And after the speech, I went over to her and I said, "Naomi, if you make an error, I should not get angry. It's wrong of me. And if I do that in the future, I want you to say to me, 'Daddy, you're not supposed to do that.'" By the way, she started saying it, and that was extremely annoying. But the truth of the matter is, it's very, very important. How many of you grew up in households where your parents never apologized to you? Okay, and quite a number of you. That's a very bad thing. Because if a parent never apologizes, they are unconsciously sending a terrible message. The message they're sending is, when you're strong, you don't have to apologize. Only weak people have to apologize when they've done something wrong. No parent, God willing, wants to send such a message. But you also have to accept full responsibility at the time of the apology. Could you imagine if I had said to Naomi, "Naomi, it was wrong of me to get angry at you, but you have to admit, when you get something wrong for the 3rd time, it is pretty annoying. It takes away all the positive of the apology." I'll give you another example, a dramatic one. Today, we take it for granted that when there is a nominee to the Supreme Court, there's going to be a fight between conservatives and liberals in the United States, and it's going to often be a very close vote, which, by the way, was not always the case in American history. Even very recently, When Ruth Bader Ginsburg was confirmed to the court, she had only 2 votes, it was like 96-2. And when Scalia was confirmed, it was unanimous. But now we know every Supreme Court fight gets very close. That wasn't normally the case in the past, but there was such a case. I think it was in 1916, the first time a Jew was nominated to the Supreme Court, which was, of course, Louis Brandeis. And there was a lot of opposition, and in those days, people, as a rule, were much more forward when they didn't like Jews. They weren't ashamed to say it. So 6 former presidents of the American Bar Association, wrote very strong letters. They didn't explicitly refer to his Jewishness, but they referred to characteristics of his that they thought made him, and they all declared him to be unfit to be president. Among the people who opposed him, but this is important, who really, really was not an anti-Semite, was former President Taft. But he really said the day Brandeis was confirmed was one of the saddest days in his life. He was convinced that Brandeis was going to do great damage to the court, that he had overly liberal views, and a whole bunch of other things. And obviously the opposition of a former president was very powerful. Nonetheless, Brandeis was appointed to the court. 2 years later, this is the only time this happened in American history, Taft was appointed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he comes to the court, and in his papers we find 2 years later a letter he wrote to his wife. He said, "Brandeis and I still have our disagreements, but I have come to like this man very much, and I have come to respect this man very much." But I left out an important thing. Before he was appointed to the Supreme Court, Brandeis had already been on the court for a while. And one day, while Brandeis was taking his nightly walk, Taft was walking there too. And when he saw him, he said to him, "Justice Brandeis, a number of years ago I did something very wrong to you, and I want you to know I apologize." Again, it was sufficient that he expressed a full apology. An apology can sometimes be very short. But when you express it, you have to take full responsibility. And ironically, when you do take full responsibility, it then makes it much easier for the other person not to be defensive and to also point out how they too might have done something wrong. So if you want to accomplish some good with your apology, you have to learn how to do that. And as I said, as became clear in this case, they actually eventually really became quite close. I want to speak now, though, about Lashon Hara. There are 3 types of speech, 2 of which are forbidden, and 1 of which the rabbis warn us to be careful about what we say. The first, you'd wonder, why is that even a question? Trivial, non-defamatory speech. "Hey, I was at a party at so-and-so's house last night. It's amazing what they've done with their kitchen." What could possibly be problematic about that? Well, 1, the other person's thinking, "You were invited to that party? Why wasn't I invited?" Or 2nd, "Now I understand. When I was solicited them to give to the synagogue building fund, they said they had no money. Yeah, they were spending it all in their kitchen." And when you start talking about other people at length, very often the conversation can start to get a little critical. Why is that? Because as a rule, what's most interesting about people is what's not so nice. If I divided this whole room here in the shul up into groups of 2, and I asked you to spend 20 minutes speaking about somebody you know in common, is it likely you would spend the whole 20 minutes saying, "Oh, you know that story that shows how nice she is? I know an even nicer story." The truth is, what's a little different is what makes people interesting. My wife, Devorah, worked for 12 years as an assistant and then as an editor to Isaac Bashevis Singer, the Yiddish writer who won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And Isaac used to say to her, "It's an interesting thing. Even good people don't like to read novels about good people. What's interesting about people is what's not so nice." I'll give you an example. I've written, and it was mentioned in passing in my introduction, I've written 4 murder mysteries. Why didn't I write a good mystery? You know what a good mystery is? There's somebody going around doing anonymous good deeds in the community, and there are 5 suspects. I actually thought that would be a great idea for a book, to call a book A Good Mystery, to be released in the Hanukkah Christmas season, and, along something lines like that. But it's really true that the details, you know why? Because when you say something nice, hey, he's a great guy, but there's one thing I can't stand about him. What do you think the next 15 minutes of the conversation are going to focus on? How he's a great guy, or what's the one thing you don't really like about him? Because that becomes more interesting. That leads us indeed to Lashon Hara. Can anybody offer a definition here of what Lashon Hara is? Yes, Paul. Speaking about people, but what introduces the word ra, which is negative speech? So, amplify. Speaking about people in a negative way. Is Lashon Hara true? Usually people say it's like gossip. Is it true? And most people think, yeah, sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. The thing that's not that widely known about Lashon Hara is that it is always true. There was a rabbi I knew in Connecticut who was very, very helpful to me in many ways, and he also gave me a great definition of Lashon Hara. He said it's a mean-spirited truth. So Lashon Hara, by definition, is something true. But telling it, if it's not necessary, is a mean thing to do, and I'll explain to you why. By a show of hands, how many of you can think of at least one incident in your life that it would be embarrassing to you if it became known to everybody here? Okay. Whoever's hand has not gone up is either not telling the truth or has a very bad memory. We all have something in our lives that would be embarrassing, and you would regard anybody who revealed it to others as having done a very bad thing, in many ways an unforgivable thing. I would argue that when it comes to Lashon Hara, it's a really systematic violation of the golden rule. Because if you were about to walk into the room and you opened the door and you heard the people inside talking about you, chances are what you would least like to hear them talking about are your character flaws and the intimate details of your social life. When we gossip about other people, one of the most common subjects people talk about are other people's character flaws and the intimate details of their social life. And so that's what makes it so unfair. And that's what we have to try and repress, even though it's hard to do so. It once occurred to me, and I was speaking in the Orthodox world, but I think this is true, could be true of people in general, but I asked them, when is Lashon Hara most likely to be spoken? At the Friday night Shabbat table, because it's the most luxurious, slow-moving meal of the week. That's why some people insist on talking about the Torah portion of the week at the Shabbat table and singing Zemirot, singing songs. Because often when people get together, they will devolve into that sort of chatter. So it takes self-control to make a decision, but it's good. If once a day you can think of something not so nice you're going to say about somebody and can ask yourself, does the person I'm telling this to really need this information? Is it fair? And is it fair is also a big question, because very often that piece of information can affect the other person's whole attitude towards the person, even though it doesn't really adequately describe the entirety of the other person's, of what the other person is. There is, by the way, a third type of Lashon Hara, a third type of forbidden speech called Mozi Shamrock, and that's where you spread lies about another person. So here for the moment, we'll think, okay, at least that we don't do. But the truth is, we do it very often, and I'll tell you why. If you spread rumors that you've heard, most rumors, number one, are not positive. Most rumors are not, hey, did you hear that so-and-so is really a wonderful person? That's generally not how rumors work. Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, used to say, Very few people gossip about other people's secret virtues. So they don't normally gossip about that. So let's say the rumor turns out to be untrue, and it's negative. Well, you spread a lie about another person. So you'll say, well, it wasn't really a lie because I thought it was true. But that's like a drunk driver who hit somebody who said, well, I didn't intend to hit them. But guess what? If you drink liquor very often and you go driving, sooner or later you're going to hit somebody. And if you spread rumors that are negative, sooner or later, some, maybe even many of them, are going to turn out to be untrue, and you will have done very, very great damage with your tongue. So in other words, there's a real vigilance that's required. When I wrote the original edition of Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, I had been very consumed with the aspect of the harm done by words. I got married late in life. I got married when I was 39. And so I became a parent relatively later in life. And I think that's one of the things that attuned me also. Guess what, Joseph? You got to also speak more about words that heal. Because the power of words to heal is also very, very great. There's a book, if you've never heard of it, I would order. It's called My Grandfather's Blessings. Have any of you ever heard of that book? Okay, you're lucky if you read it. And it was written by a woman named Rachel Naomi Remen. Rachel Remen is a doctor. I'm not sure if she's still with us, but and the book is a series of short incidents from her life, but obviously a very major one of those incidents was from her grandfather, my grandfather's blessings. She grew up in a relatively secular, very professionally successful household. It was the sort of household ambitious, where if she came home with a 98 on a test, her father would say, what happened to the other 2 points? And as Remen said, I spent a good part of my life pursuing those 2 points. The one place where she didn't feel judged quite like that was at her grandfather's house. After school on Friday, she would go to her grandfather's house. Her grandfather was a rather pious Jew, and he would sit with her. He introduced her to drinking a glezel tea, a glass of tea. And then he would stay with her, particularly in the winter months when the Sabbath is ushered in early, and he'd light the candles and he'd bless her. And there's a tradition in Jewish life to bless your children on Friday night. In the case of girls, what's the blessing you give them? Any of you know? May God make you like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. In the case of boys, like Ephraim and Manasseh. People sometimes ask, well, if you say to girls, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, why don't you say to the boys, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? The technical reason is because Jacob really does give a blessing to Manasseh, to the two sons of Jacob, Ephraim and Manasseh. A friend of mine once said, the other reason is they're the only two brothers in Genesis who get along. What are you going to say? May God make you like Jacob and Esau? But in any case, he would give her that blessing. But then he added on something. And when I read this in Rachel Remen's book, I added it on to my life when my children were small. He always added on something they had done that week, something she had done that week of which he was proud, which meant he was always on the lookout for something good she had done. There are parents who can be very critical. They're always catching their kid doing something. He was worried about catching her he was concerned to catch her doing something good. And so when she was very young, it could be that she was able to go to sleep in a room for a few hours without having to have a light still on. Later on, if she did well on a test, he would praise that. If she did poorly but she had tried, he would praise that. The tragedy of her youth was that he died when she was only 7. And she said when he died, she was really frightened. Who's going to present me before God? And then she said she came to realize that his great gift to her was that she had learned to see herself through her grandfather's eyes, and that a person once blessed remains blessed forever. Many years later, to Remen's great surprise, her mother, well into her 80s, started lighting Shabbat candles. And one Friday night, she was sitting with her mother, and for the first time, she told her mother the story of her grandfather's blessings. And when she finished, her mother said, "Rachel, I want you to know I blessed you every day of your life. Only unlike your grandfather, I didn't have the wisdom to say the blessings out loud." So the most important thing about words that heal is that they are said. Not that they are thought, but that they are said. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples, and then I'm going to open it up for more discussion. Alan Dershowitz, the lawyer, how many of you have ever heard him speak? Okay, a very large percentage of the people. Alan Dershowitz has a somewhat aggressive personality. It does not strike you as the sort of person who grew up as a highly insecure person. Dershowitz, in a book he wrote, Letters to a Young Lawyer, confesses that he was 15 years old before anybody ever told him he was smart. He was a troublemaker in school, which probably isn't, if you've seen him in action, you're probably not shocked to hear that. His mother was called into the school so often that his friends thought that his mother worked at the school. Anyway, when he was 15, his parents came from a strictly Orthodox home. His parents sent him to an Orthodox summer camp where he was working as a waiter. And he got friendly with the drama counselor at the camp, an older man. He was in his early 20s. And they used to talk with him about the sorts of things, young kids in their teenage years start talking about. Religion, philosophy, girls, the whole gamut of things. And one day, this older guy said to him, his early 20s, said, "You're really smart." 5 words, "you're really smart." It so happens that the fellow who said it went on to be a major rabbinic figure. His name was Irving Greenberg. Anyway, so Dershowitz says, and I've questioned him about it because it sounded so exaggerated, he said those words literally changed his life. He said it was the first time anybody had ever told him he was intelligent. He was thought of as being argumentative, he was thought of as being a troublemaker, but nobody had ever said to him he was really intelligent. And he said, I started thinking, how would I act differently if I was intelligent? And he said within 1 year, he ended up getting into Brooklyn College. He went from being a C student to being an A student. He said, my whole life I was never a B student. And I asked him, I said, did it really have that impact on you? And he assured me that it did. And needless to say, Yitz Greenberg was very important. He was my favorite teacher when I went to Yeshiva University. And I called him up and told him this when I read it in Dershowitz's book. And he said, yes, Dershowitz has really told me that. So you never know the effect that certain compliments, particularly if they really are coming out of the heart. As Dershowitz put it, Greenberg had no need to flatter me. He meant it, obviously. Remember Alan Sherman, the comic songwriter, Hello Mother, Hello Father? He grew up in the 1930s. In what was then a more uncommon circumstance, his mom was divorced, had no real money, so they lived with his grandmother. One day when he was 8 years old, he hears his grandmother saying, they were having a gathering at her house that night, a bit of a party, and he hears his grandmother saying that she needs a football. He's 8 years old. An 8-year-old boy wants to be a hero. So he decides he's going to get his grandmother a football. He goes out and trades away his best toys to get a football, shines the football, and brings it home and leaves it downstairs for his grandmother. His mother comes home and starts yelling at him, Alan, why do you leave your toys around? He says, it's for Grandma's party. He said, what are you talking about? She said, Grandma needs a football. His mother starts laughing at him. What do you mean? You don't understand your grandmother's English? She needs a fruit bowl. So the young boy is so hurt and so insulted that he goes up to his room and slams the door shut and doesn't come out, even as the guests are coming. Finally, his mother comes up and says, Grandma insists you come down. His grandmother is walking around the party with a very large fruit bowl, and in the middle of the fruit bowl is a football. And when they say to her, what's a football doing there? She explains what Alan had done, and in 6 words she says, from a child is beautiful anything. That assuaged his heart. That's what I mean when I speak of words that heal. But words can heal on a much bigger level as well. I'm going to give 3 examples. and then I'm going to have one very short conclusion. But I want to give 3 examples. The first black congresswoman ever elected was a woman named Shirley Chisholm. Strangely enough, I have occasion to write about Shirley Chisholm in my book on the Lubavitcher Rebbe, because she had a remarkable encounter with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, which affected her greatly, and she cited him in a very complimentary way. But that's not the story I'm going to talk about. In 1972, she became the first woman and the first black woman to enter a Democratic primary for president. She was one of 7 Democrats who entered the primary. She made it very clear at the time. She said, I know I'm not going to win, but I want to establish a precedent. The person who did win was George McGovern. But the other more famous person than Chisholm who ran in that primary was George Wallace, the governor from Alabama, who was famous for saying segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. It was during that 72 campaign that an assassin tried to murder Wallace and shot him. He shot right towards his midsection, and Wallace became paralyzed for the rest of his life in his legs. You know, he was always then in a wheelchair. 3 weeks after Wallace was shot, Shirley Chisholm showed up at his hospital. He looked up and he said, Shirley Chisholm, what are you doing here? And she said to him, because I don't want what happened to you to happen to anybody. And she took his hand and they prayed together. They both considered themselves to be religious Christians. Wallace's daughter was present. She said, that act is what started the whole transformation in my father's personality, to which he became an anti-segregation person. One of the things Chisholm asked of him later was, she wanted in the minimum wage bill domestic workers to be included. It used to be, you worked cleaning somebody's house, you had no minimum wage guarantee. And George Wallace, the last person you'd think who would do it, was calling up Southern congressmen and telling them they needed to vote for this. It culminated, he went to the Montgomery Baptist Church, the most famous black church in Montgomery, in which he said, I have come to understand what pain is through my own experience, and I have come to understand that I caused pain to so many of you here, and I want to apologize. One of Chisholm's assistants was angry at him, understandably, for going to Wallace. Said, why would you go to him? And Chisholm said to her, she says, you never know how one act of kindness can change everything. I'm not saying it could work with everyone, but she took that chance. I'll give you a second example of imaginative kindness. I'm going to have to read this because let me see if I can find it quickly. If I can't, I won't do it. I always think I know what I'm doing on these computers. Okay, since I'm not finding it, I'll relate it as I got it. I'm working on a book now called Moral Imagination. And it's a very, very important book to me. And I had sent a video of a talk I had given on it to a friend of mine, Jerry Zucker. Jerry has been forever a film director and producer. One of his famous films was a film he did actually 40 years ago called Airplane, which he had done with his brother David and Jim Abraham. And then Jerry did a movie called Ghost. How many of you remember that movie, Ghost? Okay, many of you remember it. And so I sent Jerry a copy of a speech I had given, and he wrote me back, which I'm now not finding there, but he wrote me back and he said, there's also imaginative kindness. As I was listening to your speech, I thought of such an act. He said, I had produced a movie some years ago called My Best Friend's Wedding. The movie was shot in Chicago, and my parents live where I grew up in Milwaukee. So my parents, which is quite near, so my parents came down to watch the film. The star of the film was the actress Julia Roberts. And Julia Roberts came over, and I introduced her to my parents, and she said to my parents, hey, would you like us to take a picture together? She said, and he writes, my mother, always the actress, jumped right in and took some photos with her. My father never liked to be in front of a camera, so just let Charlotte do it. They finished the pictures, and he says Julia Roberts, instead of walking away, walked over to my father, put her arm around him, said to the photographer, take some pictures. I want a picture with Mr. Zucker. And so a picture was taken. Years later, Jerry writes me, his father was in the Milwaukee Jewish Home for the Aged and was suffering from dementia. His mother put the photograph up on a bulletin board. All of a sudden, people all over are coming to speak to his father and saying, "Hey, what was it like for you to be on a set with Julia Roberts?" He said, "I am convinced that my father even got better medical care because of that photograph." And as Jerry put it, sometimes an act of kindness can have impacts that you never imagine it could act, that you never imagine it could achieve that sort of effect. And this is yet again an act of real imagination. I'll give you a third example. Abraham Torski was a dear, dear friend of mine. Abraham Torski was a Hasidic Rebbe who, oddly enough, by coincidence, also came from Milwaukee. And early in his life, he decided he wanted to be a doctor. So he went to the local university, Marquette, in Milwaukee, and he entered the medical school. By his last year, or his last year and a half, he owed $4,000 in tuition, which today, of course, sounds like a very small sum, but in the late 50s was the equivalent of like $50,000 today, and he was out of money. At a meeting of the board of Marquette, the actor Danny Thomas was a member, and he said, "Tell the rabbi he's got the $4,000. Somebody from the board tells a journalist in Chicago who writes this up in a story. And that day, Rabbi Torski's wife calls him and says, "You have the $4,000, Danny Thomas." Now, Torski was a Hasidic Jew. I don't think they had a television in the house. He didn't know who Danny Thomas was. But nonetheless, Thomas called him, and Thomas said to him, he said, "You know, I was happy to do it, but I wanted it to be anonymous. I didn't want it to be publicized in a newspaper," and Torski, of course, thanked him. A few years later, Torski had occasion to be in Los Angeles. So he went over to Thomas's house, and again, Thomas said, "You know, I really am unhappy. That was supposed to be anonymous." And Torski said a very interesting thing to him. He said, "Mr. Thomas, every day newspapers are filled with terrible stories of terrible things people do to each other. Do you really think it's so unfortunate that there's an article in the newspaper about how a Lebanese Catholic helped a Hasidic Jew become a doctor?" And I was thinking about that, and what prompted me actually to think about it exactly today was David Gilbert had texted Donna. He said, "Don't mention my name at the speech. This was just a private act on my part. It's a mitzvah. It doesn't have to be done with any purposes other than that. I don't need any publicity for this." And I told Donna this story about Danny Thomas, and we decided, yeah, let's publicize it. Because as a result of publicizing it, it can motivate other people to do more. If all good acts were always done anonymously, other people wouldn't necessarily get the idea to do it. Sometimes when you hear that somebody has done something, it opens your mind up. Sometimes when you hear that somebody has acted more generously than you might have acted, it motivates them to be more generous than they might have been. So I wanted really today to look at words that hurt, words that heal, and to propose the following suggestion. It is now 2:57. Can people make an effort for the next 24 hours to try and not use any words that hurt, and to the extent possible, use words that heal? Sometimes I've proposed this to people, and I say, 24 hours, I don't know if I can do it. I can do 3 hours, and then I'll say, which 3 hours? They said, yeah, between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. No, but I say to people, if you don't think you can do it, it means you've lost control over your tongue. Because if I said to you, can you go 24 hours without taking any alcohol, and somebody said, no, I can't do it, I said, well, then you're an alcoholic. If you can't go 24 hours without drinking alcohol, it means you can no longer control your drinking. And if somebody tells me they can't go 24 hours without smoking, I'd say, well, then that means you're addicted to nicotine. So the question is, can somebody go 24 hours and try it? And by the way, if in the middle you realize you've broken it, don't give up, just try and go back and continue resuming doing it. But really guarding your tongue And seeing, because it becomes second nature often to say negative things when they are not necessary. There are limited instances where somebody, if your friend's about to invest somebody in what you for a fact know is a Ponzi scheme, believe me, speak up. But that's not our normal day-to-day challenge that comes. We often say critical or snide comments about far less serious matters. So, can you do it for 24 hours? I'll just conclude with one thought from Nachman of Bratslav. Nachman of Bratslav was a Hasidic Rebbe who lived a short life. He was only, I believe, 38 when he died, but he left an enduring impact. One of the things Nachman used to teach was, if you're not going to be a better person tomorrow than you were today, what need do you have for tomorrow? I once concluded a speech like that, and somebody said, Joseph, that's a real downer way to conclude a speech. What need do you have for tomorrow? So I'm going to rephrase Reb Nachman. I wish all of you a good today and an even better tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Rabbi Telushkin, thank you very much for that wonderful, inspiring talk. Do we have some time to take questions?
Certainly.
Okay, so if you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand. I'll come to you.
Rabbi, thank you for a wonderful, wonderful speech. I have a question. You talk about words that hurt, words that heal, the power of speech. What about the power of no speech and the wisdom to know the difference? You know to speak well when you know not to speak.
When is there a time not to speak? There's one noted time in Jewish tradition when you enter the home of a person who has suffered a terrible loss. When you enter a home, for example, where a shiva, a mourning period, is being lost. And a lot of people don't know what to do there. But Jewish law really does have a suggestion. Just sit there quietly and say nothing. They base it on an incident in the book of Job, where Job suffered such a series of calamities. I don't even want to enumerate them, but believe me, they're the worst calamities, including the death of his children. And they sit with him for 7 days in silence. That's not normally going to be the case. But why do the rabbis say you should sit there silently? Because they want the mourner to have the choice of either saying nothing or speaking and choosing what to speak about. Sometimes the mourner, or more often, will want to speak about the person who died, and sometimes the people who come in feel that to lighten the mood, they'll speak about something else. I have been at houses observing Shiva where I heard people talking about the pennant race. And sometimes people will start speaking about the person who died at a point when the mourner needs to break away from that for a moment. So there really are times to be silent, and times to exercise tact and to know and let the mourner guide the conversation. And we don't only have to talk about a mourner who's mourning a terrible death. You know, anybody who suffered some sort of a calamity, do you do it? And what happens if you haven't seen somebody and 2 years have passed? Do you immediately bring up the tragedy? I don't want to speak about this at length. A year ago, Devorah and I lost the youngest of our 4 children. And somebody who I really hadn't seen suddenly starts coming up to me and offering all sorts of consolation. And it reminded me, this happened very, very recently. And it reminded me of a passage in the Talmud. Rabbi Meir taught, and it's funny, you know, I read this passage many, many years ago, and it obviously didn't impact me as it impacted me this time. But Rabbi Meir said, a person who encounters a person after a year after they had such a death and starts offering, you know, very smartly worded words of consolation is like a doctor who comes to somebody who had a broken leg that finally healed and said, let me break your leg again. I have an even better way to make it heal. You know, sometimes people, you know, think, oh, a woman wrote me who's a writer. Why at this point are words failing me? And I remember I wrote back to her, words are failing. I didn't say it at all in a critical way, because I didn't mean it critically. I said, words are failing you at this point because there are no words. We have to recognize that not everything not all pains are addressable by words. And when that happens, we should refrain from words. But having said that, when words that heal can be helpful, we got to use our imagination to find those words, because they can be balm, just balm, B-A-L-M, and they can be very, very helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Donna.
It's your presence and being there that speaks.
Oh, yes, right.
Yeah.
No, that's very important. It is very important to go. I know sometimes when a terrible tragedy, what this woman said was, it's your presence that also speaks. I know sometimes when a very bad tragedy happens, there are people who don't show up because they're literally afraid to go. They don't know what to say, and it makes them so uncomfortable. That's, again, helpful. Just go, even if you don't speak. The worst thing is that when people feel that they're almost like pariahs, not that people want to make them feel like pariahs, but they feel almost like pariah. Nobody wants to be near them, and all they need, right, all they need is to have people present. Thank you. That was a very important point.
Thank you, Rabbi. I was going to ask a question about civic cruelty. What, as a community, is a proper response when the discourse in the wider community it gets so hateful? I mean, is there anything an individual can do aside from teaching the next generation that this is not something that we want to continue as a community? What would be your answer to, as a community, how do you respond to the civic cruelty that you might see?
This is a very tricky issue, and my position on it, I know because I've argued it with some of my friends, and I have a somewhat idiosyncratic position on it. If you believe that a candidate who you support for a variety of reasons have done things that have gone beyond the bounds of decency, don't vote for that person. Because if there's no punishment, even though we run the risk then that somebody else might come in and do other things that are bad. But if somebody is not in any way held accountable for when they do something really wrong, it's going to have its long-term effect is also very bad. And I know many, look, and obviously there are extreme situations where I wouldn't follow that either, where I'd think that the alternative is so awful, that I wouldn't want to follow that. But there is a reason the rabbis go out of their way to say that the second temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, causeless hatred. Now, interestingly, they don't say it's always forbidden to hate, but it's very, very limited when you should. But where do we reach that level of causeless hatred? I suppose it's when people think that the truth is 100% on one side. What I always urge people to do, I got this idea years ago from a friend of mine, Erwin Kula, but I think he got it from my friend Yitz Greenberg. Can you find any partial truths in the position with which you disagree? Because that then becomes the beginnings of the possibility of some reconciliation. I used to go around, I'm going to take off the agenda the 2020 and the 2016 presidential campaigns, which were somewhat unique. But I used to ask people every 4 years, and my politics have generally been moderately right of center. But I used to ask people every 4 years, can you think of a single reason why somebody is voting for the candidate you oppose that doesn't reflect badly either on their intellect or their character? And I rarely found that firebrand conservatives and firebrand liberals could ever think of a single reason somebody might have voted for the other party that didn't reflect badly on either their intelligence or their character. But then we're in a real problem spot. Christina Hoff Sommers, who was a conservative philosopher, in a talk that she was giving, pointed out that a 2019 pretty comprehensive study of Americans found that like 42% of liberals thought conservatives were evil, and about 40% of conservatives thought liberals were evil. 16% of liberals thought the country would be better if conservatives all died, and 20% of conservatives thought the country would be better if all liberals died. You know, I said I have a sneaking, they didn't do polls in the 1850s, but I have a sneaking suspicion that that probably would have been revealed then too in the years that led up to the Civil War. You can't have that level of animosity without it ultimately exploding. And that explosion it can be worse. So how do we find a way to maintain civility in the face of that? Number one, we have to have civility within our interpersonal relations. It's not good if all of your friends basically think almost identically to how you think, because inevitably when you're going to be talking amongst each other, it's going to be very hard to really be fair about the other group. So can you find any partial truths in the other side, as the basis of an improvement? And look, and there are issues on which I find it very hard to find any justification for the people, for example, who opposed Israel being given $1 billion for the Iron Dome. Okay, but there were less extreme positions than that. And I suppose it starts with not always going to the most extreme positions on the other side. And where you take a principled position, but you attack to the extent that you can, you attack the position, but not the person. Because most people don't see themselves in their own eyes as evil, so try and understand ways in which they could have come to that position without being motivated by evil thoughts. This is, believe me, this is not easy, and obviously this is a sensitive issue for those of us because we know historically what happened to the Jews, and we know historically what's going on with Israel. And I suppose it also involves not being very careful before we make generalizations. That's what it is. I suppose the trick for me will be how do I apply it on a case-by-case basis, and that isn't, I acknowledge, always easy. Yes?
First of all, thank you for opening your presentation to the public. With reference to when to speak, when to...
I'm going to only ask, can maybe take off your mask so you can speak louder.
Is that okay?
I don't have the world's greatest hearing. All I heard so far was that I gave an unbelievably, extraordinarily good speech, and you just wanted to congratulate... No, seriously,
And
let
I
me
have
hear
my
what you were
hearing
saying.
aids in. First of all, thank you for making your presentation open to the public
Thank you.
and for sharing your insights. With reference to when to speak, when to remain silent, 2 days ago, I went to Fremont to pick up our granddaughter after her third attempt at taking her life, and not really sure how to encourage her. We're driving along the interstate, and I felt like I was just saying too much, too many words. And I said to her, I said, Claire, I'm going to have to learn when to speak and when to be silent. And there was a pretty pregnant pause after I said that. And her phone rang. A friend called to talk to her. She finished the call and she looked at me and she says, well, Pappy, how will you know when not to speak? And I said, well, I prayed. I asked for wisdom to know, and your phone rang.
Thank you. Thank you. That was poignant. Thank you. And God bless you that good things result. I can only imagine what you're feeling. Thank you for sharing that. Yes.
Rabbi, this comes from the Zoom world. Mark Hager asks, can words heal the rift between ultra-Orthodox and Reform Jews?
Can words heal the rift between ultra-Orthodox and Reform Jews? Not between all. You see that, it's like taking a position. You have to understand that sometimes a position cannot appeal to all. You have to acknowledge in advance. You're not going to get 100% support. You'll get the support from the people who want to be able to find words that can heal, who don't want to be in such anger at the other. That is one of the reasons why it's important that people do go on speaking. I'll tell you, it's a very important verse in the Bible. It's really an important verse in the Bible, and it's often overlooked. Joseph's brothers have a real problem with Joseph. And by the way, they do a terrible thing. They end up selling him into slavery, which, as I mentioned in passing, is awful. But Joseph is not an entirely innocent martyr. He was obnoxious. The young Joseph was obnoxious. He had dreams in which his brothers all bow down to him. His father very foolishly favors him over the other brothers, and doesn't do it. But then the key verse is "V'lo yachlu ledabro shalom," which can be translated in one of two ways. They couldn't speak peaceably to him, or they couldn't even say hello to him. Once we get to the point where people no longer are speaking, guess what? Then everything they know about the person comes from people other than the person. And that's where demonization sets in. So demonization sets in when we don't interact with people. So are there people? There was a book published about 15 years ago by a Reform rabbi in New York whose name I'm forgetting, and an ultra-Orthodox Jew, in which they at least listed in a respectful manner what they disagreed about. And when that's done, it's amazing, at least some of the venom goes out of it. Because when we don't speak to other people, we start increasingly to attribute terrible motives to them. And it's those terrible motives that we know as Jews what happens, because it's like non-human motives. I always wondered, how did Christians believe that Jews killed Christians and drank their blood? I mean, ironically, the Torah was the first book in history that outlawed the consumption of blood. But because once they were seen as Christ killers, they were seen as allies of the devil, so then you don't even accuse them of normal crimes. You accuse them of the worst things. So, all of these things have effects. And I am convinced that during World War II, among the non-Jews who saved Jews, were some who did so because, I'm not convinced, I know it's true, were some who did so because they had very positive interactions with Jews, and some who did so because they had negative interactions with Jews. I always consider myself an ambassador for the Jews. And by the way, if you wear a kippah, then you're representing the Jews. And it's a famous, incident in the 60s when rabbis who were supporters of Martin Luther King, and many of whom were not so traditional in their observance, so they didn't normally wear a kippah, King actually asked rabbis when they went on demonstrations to wear a kippah. He said, I want my people to see you as rabbis, which they won't necessarily do. But anyway, there has to be some form of contact. If all of the people that you interact with socially think like you do and don't argue with you, it's not good. And if you find that overwhelmingly you only read publications, which is much easier to do now on the internet, you only read publications or only watch television things that support what you do. And this is a challenge both to the right and to the left. Believe me, it's not. Some people on the left, think that that's all that the right's doing. Believe me, there's a lot of not smart, good stuff going on the left. And you have to go, sometimes you have to go to the more extreme on the right to get to some of these things. You don't have to go as extreme on the left. So it's very, very important that you maintain some ties outside. Now, I'm hoping in a smaller community like this one, maybe it's more likely to happen, simply because a lot of people know each other their whole lives, and hopefully there'll be more interaction. If you live in a very large city, sometimes it's easier to just confine yourself to people you already know. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Omaha, and welcome to those of you that are not congregants of Temple Israel. Thank you so much for sharing your story about your granddaughter. I think we'll all be thinking of you and sending you and her our very, very best wishes. With regard to, I didn't get the words exactly correct, but to restrict your response to what just happened when you're...
Yes.
Okay. Can you give us some tips about how to refrain from wanting to respond with the past 10 years of baggage that you may have been holding back, or wanting to just, come back with every single thing you've been wanting to share with this person, or
Yes.
how can we hold ourselves back
so
from
make a
that?
decision. Okay, it's a great question, very important question. You have to make a decision in your head what you really want. If you let loose with all your anger, the likelihood that that's going to lead to any improvement in your relationship is zero. Because most people don't think of themselves as really being bad people. So when you let loose with an enormous amount of anger, the other person is likely to just get defensive. And when people get defensive, they just end up returning your anger. So if your goal is, you know what, once and for all, I'm going to tell them what I really think of them, and then that'll be the end of it. I'll never have to deal with them again, or I never want to deal with them again, then let loose with all your anger. But if you can retain sufficient self-control not to do it, to realize at the moment, I have a friend who had such self-awareness that I remember once, he was very, very angry at somebody. He said, you know what? I'm not going to talk to you now because I know I'm not going to be able to express myself fairly. So I'm just excusing myself now. That required an incredible amount of self-control. He's a very close friend, a lifelong friend, a very close friend, and I was very impressed when he did that. He knew where he was getting to that point, where he was going to do that. So think through in advance. On the other hand, I have a friend who was having a meeting. Okay, I don't think any of you can figure out where this happened. So I had a friend who was a rabbi who had a synagogue president who was very mean to him. God willing, no such things ever happen in Omaha. But if you speak to anybody who's been a rabbi long enough, it turns out, he might have been a rabbi for many presidents, and sometimes there was Anyway, my friend, who I knew could be angry, he was a heroic person. He had really done acts of heroism in his life. I don't want to say more about it because then you might start trying to figure out who it is. And I knew he was going to be provoked by that president. So I spoke with him the night before, giving all my wise advice. The next day at the meeting, the president accused him of not doing anything for the synagogue, and my friend had prepared a listing of all the things he had done for the last few months. And the president rolled it up and threw it towards the garbage can like a basketball, and my friend punched him. He was no longer the rabbi at that synagogue subsequent to that act, though 6 months later, he had one moment of enjoyment. It turned out that in the local newspaper, they published that the preceding evening, the president was a person of some social prominence. The president at a restaurant had gotten into his fight with his wife, who punched him. So I must admit, I had a certain amount of nachas when I read that. No, but this obviously caused him great damage, and I knew it. It's funny, I knew. So don't you then avoid the encounter, because obviously it's going to be tempting. But if you want to affect the person, and if you think that person has any decency in them, and if they have no decency in them, why the hell do you want to affect them? I mean, sometimes it's a problem, because sometimes it can be a family member who you can't so easily get out of. But if you think they have any decency in them, focus on something they did that hurt you. This is the other important thing. Don't focus on things that make them look like bad people. Focus on things that you were hurt by. My wife had a policy. Before Rosh Hashanah, she would go to people who had hurt her, who she thought were basically good people. And she would explain how she had been hurt. And in a couple of instances, the people actually cried because they didn't realize it. But if you focus on it in a way that makes the other person seem like a really bad person, they're going to get very defensive. So most people don't want to go around. Very few people get up in the morning, look in the mirror, whose life can I really hurt today? You know, most people don't do that, and they will feel bad if they hurt somebody. Even if they think you're excessively sensitive, okay, so they'll know this is an area of excessive sensitivity. I know somebody who, if in any way my voice sounds agitated, feels very, very attacked. So I've learned over the years, even when I'm agitated, I have to adopt, a different tone. So that, that's what I would suggest. But once you let loose, it's very hard. Words that are inside you are yours. Once they're expressed, they're no longer yours. Yes.
All right, also from Zoom. Isn't your book more relevant for heads of state, heads of religion? Wouldn't it repair strife between nation states and cultures that appear apart?
Yes. I think this should I
Perfect.
think this book could do a great deal of good. No, because words are, we all speak thousands of words every day. And how we use them can play a very key role. I'll give you an example of a friendship that got a lot of attention. Because it was an unusual friendship that did cut across political lines. And it was the highly publicized friendship of Justice Antonine Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, they happen to share a deep love of opera, and they happen to both find the other ones very amusing. But there were other things as well. Ginsburg pointed out that when Scalia would find something erroneous in something she had written, a factual error, he would not discuss it at a Supreme Court meeting. He would go to her office privately and tell her that. You know, very often when we want to catch somebody, we'll do other things. A friend of Scalia's, who was of course Scalia was of course a very well-known politically conservative justice, and smart as can be. Ginsburg was also very smart, but I recently ordered a book of Scalia's opinions, and they're very smartly written and cause you to think in broader ways. Anyway, so a friend of his who was also very conservative, was a federal judge, but not a Supreme Court justice, was at Scalia's office, and he saw 24 white roses. So he asked Scalia, "Oh, is it your anniversary? Is it for your wife?" He said, "No, it's Ruth's birthday." So the friend said to him, he said, "Let me ask you, in all of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's years on the court, has she ever once given you support in what would have been a 5-4 decision?" And Scalia just said to him, "Some things are more important than votes." And that's what we have to do. And I recognize all the arguments that you can make in the other direction, but that's how you avoid civil wars.
Thank you. Rabbi Telushkin, we'll take one more question from this gentleman right here.
Really do appreciate your being here, and
Thank
the
you.
advice you're giving us, I think, is particularly useful on a day-to-day basis. It strikes me as I'm listening that much of what you're talking about might also be helpfully subsumed within a strategy articulated in another teaching, and that is to judge people favorably. And I wonder if you might comment on that and the relation of that to what you've been talking about. Thank you.
There's a very famous quotation in the Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, Hevei dan et kol ha'adam l'kav zchut, which is usually translated as judge everybody favorably. That's not actually an accurate translation of the Hebrew. I'm not saying that that's what you were basing it on, but that's actually not an accurate translation of the Hebrew, because there are people that you can't really judge favorably. You know, I mean, there are people who've done sufficiently bad things that at a certain point you can't do it. What the quote literally means, it doesn't say Hevei dan et kol adam l'kav zchut. It doesn't say judge every person favorably. It says judge the entirety of every person. Judge people based on their entirety. So in other words, if somebody does something out of character, very often fights take place even between people who have somewhat similar views over one issue, and suddenly all goodwill is joined. So judge somebody by their entirety of who they are, and then look for reasons to be favorable. That's what I meant when I spoke about partial truths. It's funny, I met a man a few years ago. A man called me up who was a big fan of my writings, and he said, I'm coming to New York, Rabbi. Let me take you out to Barney Greengrass. Have any of you ever been to Barney Greengrass in New York? You can get great smoked fish there. So we went out, and he really turned out to be somebody with very fine disposition, and he sent me his memoir, which he had self-published. And he sent me, and I read through it. He had done something very kind for me, and I felt, okay, I'm going to read his book. I get sent a lot of books, and I can't read all of them, but he had really shown me he had done me a very, very great favor. So I read his book, and it was a story of his life and business. And he mentions in passing a story there about what to do when somebody acts out of character. So anyway, he had a big company in telecommunications, and one day he calls up the accountant. He's looking over the results, and he sees a line there that doesn't make sense to him. So he calls up the accountant and says, you know, if you go to line 7 on page 6, I don't understand what you're doing there. So the accountant answers in a pretty annoyed voice. He said, well, so read it more carefully. And so he looks at it and he says, I still don't understand it. He says, well, then that's your problem, and he slams the phone. The guy, needless to say, was very upset and very hurt, and he starts, it was all in the same building, so he starts walking down the hall, you know, and he's going to really reprimand the man, or says, maybe I'm even going to fire him. But then he also, you know, was thinking about who this guy was and the years together, and he gets in, he says, you know, you spoke to me in a very discourteous, very not nice manner. He says, you know what you need? The man says, yeah, what do I need? He says, you need a hug. And he walked over and he hugged the guy, and the guy immediately, eyes welled up in tears, and started telling him of terrible problems that were going on in his personal life. And his wife was sick, and he had a whole bunch of really terrible problems. Now again, is this going to work with everybody? No. But in a sense, like what you're saying, but he realized that this was so uncharacteristic of the man, so if the man's acting out of character, so he also then should act out of character, not respond in the conventional way. And I called him up and I told him, I said, listen, I'm putting this into my book on moral imagination. He was so flattered, but I saw it. This was a characteristic feature of that man. So again, judge other people fairly, and sometimes that really does mean judging them favorably, and sometimes you have to reach the conclusion that you can't always judge them favorably, but look for reasons to understand what they're doing. And again, I'm going to conclude by wishing you, in the words of Reb Nachman, I wish all of you a good today and an even better tomorrow, and I thank you all profoundly for coming.
Now comes some words of thank you. First of all, I want to thank God for bringing us all together today so we could enjoy and learn and be inspired by Rabbi Telushkin's most wonderful speech. Thank you. There's a danger in giving thank yous because there's always the person that you meant to thank but left out. So if I leave anybody out, please accept my apology. First of all, I'd like to thank Rabbi Brian Stoller for having us here today to have Rabbi Telushkin speak, to Nate Shapiro, to Mindy Marburg, to Scott Anderson, and to Ari Katz in California, who's making this Zoom possible. I want to thank Temple Israel, Beth Israel, for co-sponsoring this event, for Chabad and the Jewish Federation of Omaha. I'm so grateful to have Rabbi Telushkin as my friend and my teacher for over 50 years. He's made a difference in my life and the life of my family. God has blessed me with two wonderful husbands. My husband, Spencer Gilbert of blessed memory, Rabbi Telushkin was our teacher at the Brandeis Bardeen Institute, and he made a wonderful, Rabbi Telushkin and Dennis Prager made a wonderful difference in us raising our family. And when Spencer died 6 years later, I was very blessed that God brought to me Paul Van, who's now my husband. He has made helpful suggestions in making this a wonderful weekend. And a happy birthday to Howard. But I'm so grateful to Joseph for so many things. He hopped on a plane, his first plane for a year and a half with Chabad, with COVID, and his teachings throughout the year. So I'm going to give a challenge to myself. I'm going to do a mitzvah or a kind word and think where I can do these acts of good, and I challenge you to meet my challenge. Again, many, many thanks. Words that come from the heart enter the heart. You've touched us all, and we're so grateful. And now let's celebrate, and there's going to be a dessert reception. Please, everybody, join us and have a good time.